Good morning. Truth Seeker here. And as you can see, it is a cold and blustery day. Um, I've been trying with little success uh, to capture the background, and the lighting is a little tough for me to get right. So my face is dark. Uh, I think that's because it's tremendously bright behind me. We had 6 inches, 7 inches of snow last night, and it snowed hard for a while. And we had to cancel a family function because of that. So I think that the scenery behind me looks a little better than me, so I don't mind my image being dark. So I don't think any of you are going to complain either. You have the beautiful winter scene behind you, although I hate winter. And when I finally do retire, I'm not going to be sticking around in a cold climate, that's for sure. I just can't do it. And the doctors tell me I can't go out in this kind of weather anymore and exercise because of my heart condition, and that it constricts the blood vessels, and the heart is deprived of the blood it needs, and I don't feel like falling over somewhere in the middle of some frozen ice field and meet my demise in that fashion. I'd rather meet it on a warm, sunny beach somewhere in a semi-tropical climate. But anyway, I wanted to talk about something. It's been a little bit since I made some videos. I just posted one up. It'll be coming up in a few minutes. And I'm making this video. It's not that I haven't been planning videos. The problem has been my health. I've been suffering some ill health lately, and my free time has been taken up going to doctors. And actually, I'm scheduled for some surgery on the 28th, and so I'm hoping that's going to go well, and that I can be nice and fit and ready to go this coming summer. So best to get everything done in the wintertime so I can really enjoy the short summers that we have up here. When I say short, shorter than I'd like to have, so that's my personal preference. So enough for the intro, and the topic of today's video, as you kind of suspect right now, I pick offbeat kind of topics in the sense that it's not the usual sex abuse, shunning. Is it scriptural? All of the abuses of Watchtower that are typically talked about and affect everybody's lives, and the Bible students. I mean, they to me, they're two sides of the same coin. I mean, the Bible students started the movement. 50 years Bible students were associated with Watchtower, and then the movement changed its name, and the movement associated with Watchtower became Jehovah's Witnesses, and Rutherford put his mark on the movement, and that mark has remained pretty much ever since. That hasn't changed. The only thing I think that has really changed since Rutherford's time is that the governing body has diluted the level of knowledge and responsibility that they expect their followers to hold. And this is an increasing trend. So it's just, well, the time is late. Just hang on to what you have, and hang on to us, and you'll make it through Armageddon. And they use these scare tactics, and they while they don't want people to stop doing the witness work. I did a video that looked at some statistics, and it's clear that the witness work, the door-to-door witness work, has failed. That over the last since 1997. The door-to-door witnessing has been almost wholly ineffective. That the numbers of baptized have flattened out, despite a tremendous increase in the number of hours that people have put in the door-to-door, and so. That shows that all of the growth is internal, that they're mostly born-ins. There are fewer converts externally, and they're all born-ins. And that's what happened to the Bible students. But the Bible students, they were much more successful in converting their children by proportion, and so the Bible students still exist today, even though there are very few around. Bible students never put the emphasis into the witness work that the Jehovah's Witnesses have, and yet the movement still exists. So by the fact that a proportion of those that are born into the religion will remain in the religion means that by its own sort of momentum, the religion will carry on, even despite whether or not a leadership exists. The Bible students' leadership passed away in 1916. That was Charles Taze Russell, and yet the movement continues. There are always followers. There are always people who will take over some of the work and continue. And there were several divisions after Rutherford took over the presidency of Watchtower. You had P.S.L. Johnson, who took and started the Layman's Home Missionary, and I think there was I can't recall his name right now, but there's the Pastoral Bible Institute, and then in 1932, the Dawn Bible Students formed, and that was mainly motivated by a fellow by the name of Norman Woodworth. Although he had a number of close associates that supported him, a brother George Wilson, and a George Pollock, George Russell Pollock, actually his name was. He liked to go by the name of Russell Pollock because of Pastor Russell. And Bible students, Russell is still their leader. And he's been dead for over 100 years. And I've been really, over the last number of years, I've really devoted a lot of time to studying that transitional period between Russell's death and the time when Jehovah's Witnesses became a a sect, a separate sect in its own right. And I've always been fascinated, like with the Dark Ages, periods of time where there's shrouded in mystery. And you see, Watchtower has never given its history in a true and objective manner, non-biased manner. They would have people think that the transition into Jehovah's Witnesses was a natural transition and that it happened smoothly without controversy. And who's gonna deny that? But it's not true. It's not true. There was quite a bit of turbulence. The Rutherford ran into a tremendous amount of resistance within internally in the Bible students because there was such a reverence for Charles Russell. And Rutherford, this got under his skin. Now, Rutherford actually, when you look at the psychological profile of Rutherford, everything that you read about his personality and his characteristics, he was in my mind, I think there's very little doubt that he qualified for being mentally disordered himself with a disease called psychopathy. And I'm not going to go into the details to justify it, but he met all of that criteria, and he was just a nasty son of a gun who didn't care about anything but himself, and he was ruthless. And you can't expect a person who doesn't feel remorse and it can't feel empathy to respond to letters like Olin Moyle wrote. I really highly recommend that people study the history. It's right there in places like JW Facts. There's much there that Paul Grundy has written himself from his own research, but he's got the materials there that can help you do your own research into these things and to see what kind of things occurred during that transitional period. And it's very disturbing in a way to see what Rutherford did in ousting up to 75% of the original movement that supported the Watchtower. Only about a quarter of the original movement remained loyal to Rutherford and to the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society. And they went on to form the nucleus of the Jehovah's Witnesses. And although initially the loss of 75% of the membership of those associated with Watchtower set back Watchtower's forward growth and momentum for a while, it was recouped by the time Rutherford passed away in early 1942. He didn't even see World War II. He just, the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and that was about it. He passed away in January 8th of 1942. And the guy couldn't even keep from causing controversy after his death. He insisted on being buried there at Beth Sarim, his private little heaven, and the city of San Diego denied that, and there's all kinds of conspiracy theories around that Rutherford was actually secretly buried on Beth Sarim somewhere, and that he wasn't really transported all the way back to Staten Island to the Watchtower secret burial grounds where nobody has a marker, which I think is really ridiculous. But anyway, The interesting thing that I wanted to talk about today was going back into J.W. Fact's information. Now, I think what Paul Grundy did there, it was fantastic, and I think it's important. I think it's important that people know their history so that they can know exactly what it was that they're dealing with. Human foibles, human characteristics. This was not a movement that was blessed of God or Jesus. There was no supernatural guidance behind it or involvement. It was clearly a very, very human organization, and the people who were running it were just nasty people. And Knorr, who took over, wasn't any better really than Rutherford, and Fred Franz was not a very nice person himself. So, I mean, what he could do to his own nephew was evidence of that. So, as a kid, my family went back many, many years into the Bible students. And parts of my family actually date back into the Bible students movement as early on as the 1890s. My father's side of the family. On my mother's side of the family, it was a little later, but not much. 1909, and they immigrated from Scotland, and they moved into Brooklyn. And they were right near the Watchtower itself, and it was actually the purser of the steamship that they sailed from Scotland to the U.S., who was a Bible student himself, who put them in touch with the Brooklyn Bethel, which had just that year moved from Allegheny, Pennsylvania, to Brooklyn, New York. So my grandparents, great-grandparents, my grandmother was a child at that time, 6 years old when they first came into contact with the Bible students. They were impressed with Russell and met regularly. Were devout Bible students throughout the time Russell was alive. When Rutherford took over, they left immediately. They left before any of these other, like Layman's formed or PBI formed, because they just did not like Rutherford. And they left early. And they did not come back into contact with Bible students until the 1930s. So they did find the Bible students again later on, but there was a whole period of time, 20 years or so, where they were isolated away from the Watchtower and away from the Bible students movement. So as a kid, I was somewhat precocious. I was one of those kinds of kids that when you had company, I always wanted to sit at the adults' table. I never wanted to sit with the kids. There was, I don't know if parents still do that anymore, but they used to have an adult table and they would have a kids' table. And it was common practice. Put the kids in another room and they could play and make cracks and just be children at their own table, and the adults could have the more serious conversation at the adults table. And I always wanted to sit at the adults table. And my family mostly originated from Florida. My grandmother grew up there. in St. Petersburg. She was born in 1899, and so she grew up in St. Petersburg um, for most of her life. She lived in Florida. My grandfather, who married her, lived the greater part of his life in Florida. He was born in Wisconsin and then moved down. He hated cold like I hate the cold, and so he went to Florida. But back when he went, it was nice and cheap to move to. Nobody wanted to go to Florida. It was not a. It was not the. It was more of a mosquito-infested swamp back in the 1920s. So it was not the vacation spot. Miami was, but not the rest of Florida. And so. As a child, most of my family was down there. I had aunts and uncles and cousins, and we would go down maybe once or twice a year. My father, he had moved to New York to make it in the big time. He wanted to be near New York City, where he was going to be. I don't know. He got a job on the Wall Street area for a shipping company, and I guess he had ideas of making it big in the Wall Street area, and so he left Florida. But once or twice a year, we would go to Florida and visit my family. And of course, I was intrigued with them because we never really had a whole lot of time to spend with them, and 2 weeks usually at a time. And I wanted to know as much about them as I could. And so I was quite a precocious kid, and I would I would love to listen to the adults talk and hang on to every word. And I wanted to learn. I wanted to find out. I just was a very curious kid about our family and where it came from and how how our we came to be Bible students and things like that. Well, I remember very clearly listening to my grandfather. He was a quiet man, except when you got him talking about the Bible students. And then he would talk about, inevitably, he would get on to the topic of the transition period, because he became a Bible student in 1908 when he was 18. He was converted by a coal porter. And so he married my grandmother, whose family had been in the Bible students since the 1890s. And so they had a deep history with Watchtower and a strong loyalty to the organization and to Russell. But when Rutherford took over, they had decided to support the Watchtower and continue with it because that's where the truth came from. And he bought into the idea of the channel. I remember as a kid hearing him talk about the idea of the channel, that the Watchtower was the channel of truth and new light, and that they were introducing new doctrines, new light. And he bought into that to some certain extent, so that they remained with the Watchtower. But then he said the doctrinal change that did it for him, that told him that the Watchtower had finally gone too far with their doctrinal changes, was when Rutherford had changed the doctrine about Adam and Eve and saying that they were not to get a resurrection. Now, to him and to Russell, according to Russell, in fact, that was the doctrine that caused Russell and Nelson Barber to break from one another, was this understanding of the ransom. Whereas Russell believed in the substitutional aspect, that Jesus had to die as a man, a perfect man, to be an exact corresponding price for Adam, who was a perfect man who committed sin and death by sin. And so it took a perfect man's life to offer as a substitute to God in judgment, and that would redeem Adam. And then Adam and his race that were born into sin would thereby be released through this ransom sacrifice that Jesus made, and Adam and Eve and the rest of humanity would be entitled to a resurrection in the 1,000 years. Rutherford changed that doctrine and said that Adam and Eve, being perfect, were already judged, and that Jesus' sacrifice only redeemed those that were born to Adam and Eve, who had no responsibility for being born into sin, which was to them an inherited thing. So I always had assumed that that doctrinal change took place in the 1920s. After all, most of the Bible students I knew left the Watchtower by 1928. That's when Norman Woodworth left. I think John Dawson left. That's when Russell Pollock left. These were all Bible students that were pretty well known. They had a relatively high profile within the Watchtower. They were pilgrim speakers for the Watchtower. Later, they changed that name to ordained minister, but pilgrim speakers were associated. They were representatives of the Watchtower and were sent to ecclesias, which are congregations. They went back in the days of the Bible students. They went by the name ecclesia or class. They were used interchangeably, and they would send these pilgrim speakers all around the country to speak on behalf of the Watchtower. Well, I did a little study, and from 1927, which is the original yearbook, the very first yearbook that Watchtower put out, and they printed a list of these pilgrim speakers. And then I compared it to the list of pilgrim speakers that was published in 1930, and there were fewer. Okay, 1930 yearbook would represent 1929. The 1927 yearbook would represent year 1926. And so just in 3 years, there was like almost an entire overhaul of pilgrim speakers. The number of pilgrim speakers declined by a significant number. I have to pull these numbers out. I have them in a spreadsheet, but it was significant, and I think it was 40 or 50 or so out of, I think the original number of pilgrim speakers in 1926 was about 250, I say roughly speaking, and there were some 40 fewer, maybe it was 280, and there were some 40 fewer speakers in 1930. But what they did was they replaced a whole lot of speakers that were lost. They just didn't make up the full amount that were lost. So in total, there was a net difference of about 40 speakers. But the changeover in speakers, the names were all different. When you do a comparison of the names, I think it was 50 or 60% of the names were different. And so there was something radical that took place between 1926 and 1929. And of course, the failed prophecy that the kingdom would start in 1925 and that the ancient worthies would be resurrected in 1925 certainly had something to do with it. But Rutherford was also on the verge of pulling the trigger on changing the name of the whole movement by 1929, 1930. He kept talking more and more. When you look at the Watchtower yearbooks and reading the commentaries written by Rutherford, he increasingly talked about the vindication of Jehovah's name, and you could see him working the transition into Jehovah's Witnesses early on, so that when he proposed the name change, there would not be a wholesale rebellion. By then, enough Bible students, of the original Bible students, had left that there wouldn't be an outright mutiny on the Bible students' part. So, with a few 17 or 18,000 Bible students that remained in 1931, they all readily supported Rutherford's proposal to change the name to Jehovah's Witnesses. Well, I thought my family had all left in that time in the late 1920s with the rest of the Bible students. And it was to my surprise that didn't happen. Now, I remember distinctly that my grandfather said that it was that one doctrine about Adam and Eve not getting a resurrection that did it for him. So I went to Paul Grundy's website, JW Facts, and I began looking through the watchtowers, historic watchtowers, and I began looking for the time at which the names, when that doctrine would have been changed. And so I looked. It took a long time. I mean, it wasn't easy to find because by that point, Rutherford had de-emphasized the doctrine of the ransom. I mean, to Russell, the ransom was the cornerstone doctrine. He broke with Nelson Barber over that topic. And anybody who differed from Russell, that would be a disfellowshipping. Rutherford would have been disfellowshipped by Russell for the change he made in the doctrine of the ransom. There's no question. I mean, Rutherford pretty much took the same stand as Nelson Barber, and Russell disfellowshipped with Nelson Barber over that topic. So there's no question that Russell, who held firm to that doctrine of the ransom, would have taken action against Rutherford. But anyway, Rutherford was alive and Russell was dead, and I did a lot of digging into watchtowers, and it was not easy. But finally, I downloaded the August 15th, 1937 issue. That's the earliest issue that I can find where Rutherford he had written an article, and in that article he said that Adam and Eve were not entitled to a resurrection. And he said that they were judged to death, and that the ransom sacrifice of Jesus only applied to the children of Adam and Eve, but not to Adam and Eve themselves, that they by no means would benefit from Jesus' sacrifice, which was entirely different from what Russell taught. And I was shocked because that was a whole 6 years after the name change to the Watchtower, to Jehovah's Witnesses. And that meant, I got a bit of an itch, sorry. That meant my family were Jehovah's Witnesses for 6 years. And that was when they made the break, was in 1937. And I found this was true with a number of Bible students. There were a number of ordained ministers that were listed in that list that I knew, some that I was even related to, that didn't leave the Watchtower until the late 1930s. And when the Dawn Bible Students formed, their main work from 1932 through the 40s, 30s and 40s, were to regather the Bible students, the disenfranchised Bible students who left the Watchtower. And so they had done a fairly successful job through a radio program called Frank and Ernest, which targeted individuals that had left the Watchtower Society and didn't know where to meet. So the Dawn put on these radio broadcasts and had nationwide coverage by the late 1930s. And by 1946, I found, actually my brother found a legal document, because the Dawn Bible students ended up in a tax dispute in 1946. And the tax dispute ended up in Superior Court with the town of East Rutherford. And in that dispute, Norman Woodworth, who headed up, he was the managing editor of the Dawn magazine, said the judge asked him to explain what the movement was, and he gave a description of the Bible students movement and said that it was about 56,000 strong. Well, Paul Grundy has put together some statistics that showed that in the 1920s, the number of people between 1923 and 1925 increased tremendously because of the 1925 teaching. They peaked at 90,000 in the memorial numbers. Now, the memorial numbers were significant because back before the Rutherford's change of the name to Jehovah's Witnesses, he created a class called the Jonadab class that were not going to be a part of the 144,000. They were going to be the great company that inherited the earth. Before that, the great company was a heavenly class of people who just didn't quite qualify for being part of the 144,000. That was Russell's idea. But Rutherford changed the doctrine in the 1930s and said there's a whole class of people that constituted the great company or great crowd, and that they were this new class called Jonadabs, and they would inherit the earth. And they would be the ones that inherited, they'd live through Armageddon, and they would live forever on a perfect earth. So this Jonadab class was different. Nobody would partake of the memorial. And fewer people partook of the memorial in the Jehovah's Witnesses because they believed that 1935 was the end of the call to the 144,000. So in the 1920s, those memorial numbers represented the number of people who were partaking of the memorial. And that number increased up to 90,000. And then by 1928 or 29, it dropped to 17,000. Over 75% had left the movement. And this was also corroborated by 30 years. William Schnell's book, 30 Years a Watchtower Slave, said 75% of the original movement by 1928 had left the Watchtower. And so when the Dawn indicated that by the mid-40s, the 56,000, there were 56,000 members of the Dawn, and most of that would have not, I would imagine almost all of it would be in the United States. That makes sense. That makes sense. That holds. I mean, they did their best at recouping the disenfranchised Bible students. I guess some were just so disgusted they didn't want to come back, but there was a significant number. I mean, 56,000 is more than 50% of that peak number of 90,000. So the Dawn did a relatively good job of recouping the Bible students back to form a movement altogether. Of course, the movement wasn't centralized. There was never a single leader like Rutherford. The Bible students remained independent and autonomous from one another, and the Dawn Publishing Organization was a service organization rather than a controlling organization. But outside of that, there wasn't a heck of a lot of difference, especially in the early days. Not very much different between a Jehovah's Witness and a Bible student. But I just wanted to mention that because this was a dark secret that my family kept from me, my cousins, my family, for years and years, that for a short period, we were actually Jehovah's Witnesses, that my father would have been in a Jehovah's Witness congregation, and that my grandfather was a Jehovah's Witness elder until they did away with elders. I think he left before they did away with elders altogether. But I know that my grandfather was an elder, and then when he left the organization, he formed the Orlando Bible Students Ecclesia, which is today probably the largest Bible students ecclesia in the United States, just because of the retirement, aspect. People like to leave the colder north and move to Florida to retire. And so that class benefited from its location, and right now is probably the largest Bible students grouping in the United States today. I could be mistaken, but if it's not the largest, it's among the largest. So anyway, that's all I had to say. I think it's important to understand this history, because it was a very turbulent period. There were reasons. I recommend reading Olin Moyle's letter. You can find it on Wikipedia. And it was an accurate depiction of Rutherford, and it didn't paint a very nice picture of the guy. Again, I suspect from everything that I've learned about him is that he was a psychopath. So, and I'm not kidding about that. And I think that the things that he transformed the Watchtower into have remained. That's why they're such an oppressive and terrible, one of the most terrible religions to grow up in today for people and to remain. I mean, you can't, no one's safe. You can be disfellowshipped for anything, for thoughts, for dreams. My God, the latest video Lloyd Evans put out one of the later ones, Pillow Talk, where they talk about having wet dreams, and that wet dreams could be caused by you having dirty thoughts before you went to sleep. I mean, they want to regulate your dreams. That you want to talk about cult? That's cult all the way. But anyway, I've gone on too far and got a lot of other things that we could talk about. So this is Truth Seeker wishing you a good day and stay warm.